Okay, welcome everyone, and thank you for your patience with us. We're going to call this 5 o'clock study session to order. So first order of business is confirmation of a quorum, City Clerk.
Mayor Gilmore confirming a quorum.
Okay, so we'll go right into our first item, which is discussion on current city infrastructure needs, including project options, costs, and possible funding opportunities. Manuel, are you taking this?
Thank you, Mayor, members of the council. Pleasure to be here tonight to discuss with you city's public infrastructure. From an agenda perspective, just to give you an overview of what we're going to discuss, we'll start with city infrastructure and just give you some high-level details of kind of what that means. Then, of course, we have our 3 department directors here who will be discussing public works, water and sewer, and parks and recreation. I do want to highlight that Silicon Valley Power is not part of today's presentation, and certainly they have quite an infrastructure program themselves. And they did complete a study session with you about a month ago or so when they went through a high level of detail, some of their strategic planning as well infrastructure projects that will be part of the upcoming budget. The department presentations will be focused on some of the unfunded infrastructure needs as well as some of the funding options and opportunities that we have. Then we'll come back and try to summarize that for you. And really the perspective in the study session today is to be able to come back to you with a May council action for a possible tax measure. So I'm not going to go through all these elements. Just always nice to highlight the amount of infrastructure the city has and the amount of infrastructure we have to operate and maintain, storm, parks and rec, buildings, transportation, and of course, also our enterprise infrastructure, water and sanitary, and each department director will go into that with a little more detail. So with that, pass it over to Craig Mobick to discuss public works with you.
Thank you. Is that microphone on? It looks on. On? It's the same. Jim's works.
Speaking of infrastructure.
Yeah.
No, I'm just kidding.
All right,
Borrowing from Parks and Rec. Okay, here we
is
go.
that better now? Okay, perfect. So I'm going to be focusing on pavement management, the storm drain system, traffic signal infrastructure, bike facilities, as well as public buildings. So in terms of pavement management, first just wanted to go through what our proposed budget is coming up in this budget session for next year. In terms of pavement funding, we have gas tax, vehicle registration fee. We also have SB1 money that we've been getting, and then there's Measure B money slated for the city of Santa Clara. So with all those funding sources, it's about $6.3 million, and occasionally we will get some grants to supplement that money. So what I wanted to show here is here's pavement management, and there's some different funding options shown here. And so in the first column is funding level. And so what that's showing is what the annual budget could be, what the pavement condition index would be for that proposed budget after 5 years, and then what that backlog would be under that scenario. So the next 4 columns are the different scenarios. The first one being no constraints. And so if the annual budget for pavement was about $14 million, that would increase the PCI, the pavement condition index, up to about 83 from its current 76. And that would give the city a zero backlog in terms of pavement projects that are required after that 5 years. The next scenario we looked at is, well, what would be a scenario if we focused on just raising the PCI by 5? We'd need approximately $12 million in the annual budget. After 5 years, that pavement condition index would be up to 81, and that pavement backlog would then be $6.5 million. The third scenario under current funding, that's what will be in the proposed budget coming up, but that's showing the $6.37 million. And it really leaves the pavement condition index about the same. It bumps it up a point to 77, but the unfunded backlog under that scenario is $29 million. And then lastly, there's a scenario showing what it would be without Measure B and without SB1. And so that leaves us with a $2 million annual budget, with the pavement condition index dropping down to 72 and the backlog being $53 million. And why we did want to show this scenario is that we are receiving SB1 monies now, but there is a proposal out there that could eliminate that. And in terms of Measure B, we are not receiving those monies right now. That's in the courts, and talking with VTA, we're supposed to get more information and possibly a decision at the end of the year. And then lastly, I just want to talk about pavement condition index. It's not an exact science, so when you see numbers up here, there is the ability that those fluctuate a point or two here and there based on running the model and based on the current conditions. But really the focus of this slide is under the current funding allocations, that the backlog after 5 years, which is unfunded, would be $29 million. So switching over to storm drain and flood protection, the city has quite a bit of pipeline in the ground that carries the storm flows. We have multiple pump stations and lift stations, outfalls as well, and then a couple retention basins. And so several years ago, we did an analysis of the storm drain system in terms of capacity, and that's pipeline capacity. And through that analysis, there was different priority levels set. And so you can see on this chart here, the priorities range from highest all the way down to low. And really the focus on the highest priorities was eliminating the flooding events that would happen with a 2-year storm. And so that's a storm with the probability of happening once every 2 years. And what we mean by significant flooding is flooding that would be over a foot. And so when we looked at that scenario, as well as avoiding any of that flooding in critical facilities, it was about $14 million to mitigate those items. And then moving down into what we tagged as the high priorities was eliminate the remaining 2-year flooding, so flooding that would be less than 1 foot, and then focusing in on significant 10-year flooding. And so under that scenario, it was about $43 million. And then the scenarios moved on to eliminate more of the 10-year flooding as well as the 100-year flooding. And so that gave a total of $290 million unfunded. But really the focus is, you see that boxed, we boxed the highest and the high priority. That's the focus, and really wanted to select the highest priority as the ones that we really should be focusing on now, given the finances. In terms of what the funding sources are for storm drain, we do get some development fees that come in, but really that's minimal. And the new development that happens based on the regulations and the requirements to keep storm drain flows on site and not discharge them directly into the storm system, there's not a lot of water, from those new developments that come out at the peak of those storms. But really the majority of the funding comes from the general fund. There's possible funding sources related to any parcel tax measures that would be proposed, as well as any bond measures. There was Senate Bill 231 that's out there, and really what that said was that you could treat the storm system similar to the sewer system, and you wouldn't have to go out for voting to increase fees. But what one of the local public interest groups has stated, that the first city that tries to implement that will be sued, and so most of the cities here are not going to implement that based on that level of risk. In terms of the unfunded projects, we have several that are unfunded now that are in the proposed budget, and those are rehabbing the Laurelwood pump station, doing a project out at the east side retention basin for desilting. We just completed the west side this past year. And then also a project to replace the pumps out at the west side retention basin. During the last project, we were able to pull those and take a look and determine that they needed to be replaced. So we're going to be proposing a project for that. And then there's other projects related to SCADA systems, so secondary control systems that are unfunded, as well as some of the additional unfunded needs that I talked about in the first slide. Now, while those were capacity related, there's also other pump station work that's required, up to about $30 million for all the various pump stations. And then there's needs in terms of just pipeline infrastructure in its current condition and replacing damaged infrastructure. So, that's up to about $300 million, but really what we wanted to focus in on is the highest priority in this $20 to $30 million range. Now talking about traffic signal infrastructure. So we do have funding sources for that, albeit not a lot, but we do get up to about $1 million every year for projects using traffic mitigation fees. We also go out for grants, and we've been successful for those, so we apply that money to these projects as well. And then if Measure B gets passed, besides the money that we are guaranteed through it, there's also a competitive process for additional funds. So for traffic signal projects, we'd be applying for those competitive grants. Unfunded projects for traffic signals, there's adaptive traffic signals, and so what that technology does is it changes timing in intersections real time, so it gathers information on the actual vehicle speeds traveling through the intersections. It's able to change red time, green time to make it more efficient. So there's a $3 million project that's unfunded related to that. And then we have unfunded needs related to replacing existing infrastructure with the traffic signal. So the existing poles, existing controller cabinets, as well as some of the communications equipment. So that's about $50 million of unfunded need. And then work associated with uncontrolled crosswalks. So we have over 100 of those. We'd need to analyze them, look at, do we need to do anything at the uncontrolled crosswalk? Is flashing beacons needed, in-road warning lights, or even potentially hawk signals? And so when looking at those, we estimate that there's probably about $20 to $30 million of projects that are unfunded related to the uncontrolled crosswalks. Bicycle facilities, in terms of the funding sources, very similar to what I mentioned for the traffic signals, so I won't go through those again. The only difference being the funding from the grants and everything a little bit less, up to about $350,000 for those projects. What's unfunded is some of the master plans that we're doing. So we're doing the bike plan, and once we get that plan completed, it's going to develop a list of projects that are being required for implementation, and those are not funded right now. And what we speculate is those projects could range from $10 to $15 million for implementing that plan. There's also the Creek Trail Master Plan for Calabasas, Saratoga, and the Hetch Hetchy area. We're doing a similar master plan associated with that, and once that's completed, we speculate that it could be upwards of about $37 million worth of projects that come out of that study, once again, are unfunded. We also have some smaller projects in the bike facilities, implementing some bike parking infrastructure through some of the public buildings within the city, as well as some education programs and maintenance and resurfacing of the creek trails are unfunded as well. Lastly, public buildings. So we have quite a few public buildings. City Hall here, police station, 10 fire stations, the 3 libraries, maintenance facilities, as well as the Triton Museum, and 5 historic houses. Now, these public buildings basically funded through the general fund, and there's quite a bit of unfunded infrastructure associated with them. The City Hall complex, when we looked at options of building a new City Hall, separating out SVP and water and sewer, there's an unfunded need of approximately $150 to $200 million if there was ever a decision to move forward with a new City Hall. Talked with some of the other local cities that are going through this process, and they're seeing costs anywhere from about $1,500 to $2,000 a square foot for city halls. And we looked at, like I said, besides SVP and water and sewer, we'd need about 100,000 square feet. Fire stations, of the 10 of those, there's 4 that require some work, and that's Station 5, 7, 9, as well as Station 1. And it varies amongst those fire stations. I know they're going to be working on condition assessments associated with some of them, but really looking at those buildings and unfunded needs, it's anywhere from the $25 million to the $30 million range at this point. The corporation yard is another facility that's aged. We have not done any studies with it recently. The building maintenance building that's out on Lafayette across from the power station, another facility that is very old in need of some repair and or replacement. And so when we look at options, is there an option to bring that over the corp yard? You know, again, we would have to go and study that as well as develop a master plan. So until we do that, we wouldn't have any prices to share with you, and so that's a to be determined. And then the convention center as well as the garage. Really, how much money is spent on that, I think, depends on what really the future plan is for the convention center. And so once we have that plan, we've looked at some of the work that needs to be done out there and some monies. But until you know how long we're going to keep that facility, what we're going to do with it, there's really no numbers to share with you today. That's a to be determined as well. In terms of the 5 historic houses, there's always work to be done with those, whether it's roof replacements, structural repairs, electrical repairs, or just general maintenance. And we speculate that that's upwards of $2 million. And then there's some of the other smaller needs we included in the budget that you'll be seeing. But really the biggest message here is that there's no identified funding sources for these items that I mentioned. And so that concludes Public Works. I'm going to turn it over to Gary Welling for the update on water and sewer.
I have maybe a question from one council member, maybe more. So I'd like to get this, if Public Works can answer the question first. Go ahead, Councilmember O'Neill.
Thank you very much, Mayor. So thank you very much for all the information, Craig. So on the slide when you went through the unfunded projects for the storm drain, and we looked at the, kind of 2-year, 10-year, 100-year. So how much factoring in there are you looking at, like some of the most recent projections for the impact of climate change, particularly on our northern part of the city and the areas that are closest to the big creeks?
Yeah, so this particular study didn't look at climate change. What it was really looking at was the general city, the infrastructure that's built, and then the water that will be coming through the various storms. But so what will happen with climate change is your storms will be more variable, so you might get more 2-year storms, more 10-year storms, and potentially 100-year storms. So it is accounted for from the perspective of that it will, handle the 2-year, 10-year storms depending on the projects that we do.
Okay, all right. So, and then also I had a question about the adaptive traffic signals, because that's one of the things that we're looking at with our friends and neighbors in San Jose about some of the traffic conditions on Stevens Creek, Winchester, and Prune Ridge, some of the other streets there. So if we go to the adaptive, and I have, understand a little bit about the technology, just a little tiny bit. So does that, if individual traffic lights are adjusting to the traffic flow, do they still have the capability of synchronizing
Yeah, I mean, I think
within a
it's something
corridor?
that still has to be looked at, because obviously as you change one of the traffic signals, then you could be causing problems downstream if you don't modify those traffic signals. So we would need to be looking at those in a series to see how we implement it.
Okay, great. Those are my questions for right now. Thank you.
Questions? Thank you. Okay, water and sewer.
Thanks, Craig. Good evening, Mayor and Council. Gary Welling, Director of Water and Sewer Utilities. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of our infrastructure and our assessment to date. But generally, this is what we have in the water and sewer utilities. We deliver 18 million gallons of water per day through 335 miles of water main. Most of that water gets converted to wastewater and ends up going through our conveyance system and out to San Jose, Santa Clara Regional Wastewater Facility. I'll start with the water distribution. As I mentioned, we have 335 miles. We actively replace, relocate, and rehabilitate our water mains. We have a current project right now on Schaefer Drive. Our water main installations are completed in-house by city staff. We have a goal of doing about 10,000 linear feet per year. And we have a budget of about $10 million over the next 5 years. We spend about $2.5 million per year. Funding for water distribution, infrastructure, and water in general are through the rates, and we have adequate revenues at this point. Okay, sure. The other component that we're working on right now is construction of new wells and rehabilitation of existing wells. We have approximately 24 existing wells, many of those are getting older. We spend about $5 million per year on water wells, and we have an active project right now that we're going out to design to do 2 new wells, one at our Sarah tanks. We're trying to do this in conjunction with the Santa Clara Valley Water District, and we're trying to improve the intertie at our Sarah tanks. We have 2 other wells we're looking at doing, and then we're looking at 5 other locations. So hopefully in the next 5 years, we'll have at least 3 new wells. The other component of the construction for not only wells, but the distribution system, we have 4 new bridge crossings. We have a number of water distribution lines that are under the creeks, and we're trying to bring those above ground and seismically retrofit those. So that's a $2 million project that we plan to complete in the next couple of years. And the third component here is really looking at our water tanks. As we mentioned in the opening slide, we have 7 water tanks in the system. We've got three of those 7 haven't been seismically retrofitted. The rest have. And so in the next 2 years, we'll be spending a couple $1 million on those Sarah tank retrofits to seismically retrofit those and then refurbish the tanks. This next slide gives an overview of the water distribution system that we have in place currently. And if you look at the slide in the red, we have 7% of our system is between 68 and 92 years old. It's not bad for a city this size and the age of this city also. We have 57% between the age of 48 and 67 years, and 36% which are new to 47 years. So overall, in general, I think it looks pretty good from an infrastructure point of view. typical age of or useful life cycle of water distribution lines is about 110 years. So, so we're in the process of hopefully being on a 100-year cycle and getting up to three miles per year of water main replacement. But as I mentioned, I think I mentioned this last year, the beauty of the water distribution system here is that most of those lines are cement lined, which not all cities have cement lined distribution lines, and it increases the longevity of the system. Well, okay. Sanitary sewer projects. So we have we have five actually, capacity improvement projects scheduled over the next 5 years, a cost of $11 million. Again, all of our sanitary sewer projects are funded through revenues, through customer service fees. We have system improvements of about $13 million. We've surveyed about half of the conveyance system, about 123 miles of the 277. Most of that's done in-house. We have some contractors that do it too, but we do the pipe assessment. We do some of the repairs ourselves, the pipe defects, and then some of that gets contracted out. And Public Works is in the process of contracting some of that out, and they do a good job. We have about, like I mentioned, $13 million over the next 5 years to correct those pipe defects. But overall, the sanitary sewer system is in relatively good shape. Pump station improvements. We have a Rebello and Northside pump station improvements that was recently approved by City Council. Those are upgrades. They include new flow meters, bypass at Rebello, and bypass at Northside pump station. And then we're looking at doing new valving in the force main infrastructure so that we can actually do maintenance on the force mains. And then one of our largest CIP projects is the San Jose, Santa Clara Regional Wastewater Facility. Over the next 5 years, this project will spend about $1 billion in upgrades, and Santa Clara's share is about $146 million. And so it's substantial. There's a lot of projects there. I won't get into them, but essentially it's going to be a brand new facility when the projects are done. Future projects not yet funded. So we have a number of projects listed here that are not part of our current CIP projects, but they could be projects we look towards in the future. They include advanced meter infrastructure, or AMI, and that would be remote reads of all water meters. That cost is about between $9 and $12 million. It includes replacement of meters, existing meters. When we go out and replace meters now, we make sure they're radio ready. But we've got a large inventory, probably about 70%, 75%, that have not been converted. And so that's the bulk of the expense. We want to increase the water main replacement. We want to do up to maybe 3 miles a year. We'll know more when we do our asset management program next year. That'll give us a better sense of the timing and the costs and what we should be replacing. A water transmission main replacement, that potentially could be between $25 and $50 million. This is a 27-inch pipe that runs from the south of the city to the north on Tasman, and is really the backbone of the water distribution system. So we're in the process of putting together a design RFP and to take a look at that replacement or refurbishment or lining. Sewer force main capacity upgrades and rehabilitation. I mentioned the Northside pump station and some of the upgrades we're doing at Rebello. This is a separate project, and we need to take a look at those force mains and look at their longevity and the level of service they're currently providing. That cost could be $10 to $20 million. And then there's additional infrastructure needs I mentioned based on our asset management program we complete next year. And that's to be determined. And as I mentioned before, all of our funding is really from rates or debt financing. And that's what I have. I'm going to turn over to James Teixeira. So you have questions?
Okay, any questions from the council? Okay, seeing none, we'll go to Parks and Recreation, and then we'll have our questions from the public as well. Thank you.
Good evening, Mayor, Council, City Manager, staff. Jim Teixeira, Director of Parks and Recreation. And as you know, as you can see, we have a full park system or network of infrastructure assets, everything from Central Park as a community park through our neighborhood parks and aquatic facilities down to mini parks. We also manage the 2 cemeteries in the Santa Clara Golf and Tennis Center through American Golf. Our department does the operations and maintenance, and we do contract out design, do a lot of the community input on projects, but we then turn it over to Public Works, who does the plans, specifications, bid process, and then usually the contracts are put out for public bid. The issues that we have, you're not new to them, but they're aged infrastructure, and also the impacts of increased demand as well as the diversity of uses, how people want to use the park systems, buildings, et cetera. We also have future growth needs. Again, back in 2014 when we did our initial study, Nexus study, the city needs about 97 to 115 acres of public parkland, and of that about 30 acres of sports and athletic facilities within that to accommodate the needs of the growth over the life of the general plan through the general plan. There's also a 35-acre community park out at City Place that will be coming online, and we'll be planning for that. And then the major issue that we have had, and we all know, is that there are limited funding sources. We have Quimby Act and Mitigation Fee Act funds. We do have developer contributions through developer agreements. We have a very engaged community and active at fundraising and providing donations for various park assets or individual assets, everything from benches to trees to pathways, and a lot of neighborhood groups also work with us. We also have a robust volunteer program, and you see a lot of them out at Ulistack and other facilities. So we do get grants, but they're usually specified for a particular location or a particular project. And over the last year, we were successful in obtaining about $750,000 in grants. Again, some of those, Ulistack, Santa Tomas Monroe, working with collaborative partners, and the Santa Clara Valley Water District for things like habitat restoration and pathway and park trail renovation. As you know, and it's on another item for tonight's agenda, is the facility condition assessment. We completed that over with Kitchell CEM over a 9-month period, and it's the first time that the city actually had a complete inventory of all of the park assets, right down to, like I said, benches and trees and buildings, and having that understanding of it. And similar to the other 2 departments, the Facility Condition Index will now give us a measurable number that we can look at and see how we can improve against that, both on an individual asset basis as well as on a park and a building basis. It's a functional indicator that basically talks about what our repair needs are compared to the replacement cost, the total replacement cost. So it's sometimes easier to look at pictures than to just look at the words, but basically here what you see is that the critical, that's what really what a failure looks like when it comes to something that's between a score of 31 and 100. Obvious deterioration, frequent failure, areas shut down, and it's at the end of its useful life, so it does have to be replaced. Poor, 11 to 30, it's worn, it's got increased failure, there's extensive repairs, and there's frequent user complaints. Oftentimes the council and city manager's office hears those and shares those with us, and we do what we can to address them. Then there's fair, 5 to 10. You do see a little bit of wear. There are sometimes systems or components that need replacement, and certainly additional personnel and time to fix them. Finally, we do actually have a lot of good facilities, and the Kitchell report will indicate that. They're clean, they're functional, they've got just normal maintenance. There's no deferred maintenance on that. There are a few failures here and there, unexpected, but we can do preventative repairs as well. This gives just a quick understanding again of what the percentages are of the different site conditions. We have 6 park sites. That would be the grounds, the things that you normally see out and about, as opposed to on the right-hand side, those are the buildings. Everything from a restroom building, a warehouse, a shed, or a community center, or let's say the International Swim Center buildings. Poor, we have 16 park sites, about 34%. That's the list that's there. And if there were questions, I could basically tell you, you could go to the Kitchell report and find out exactly what are the deficiencies that make up those percentages or those numbers. Again, on the next slide, park ground needs. I think on here it's distribution, again, by those scores that I just mentioned. And what you can see, if you go along the totals line, the current needs first 5 years for our park grounds is about $12 million. Then in the next 5-year time frame for a CIP, about 6 million, 6.6 million. And then the next 10-year, and the further out you go, these would be estimates, 29 million. So the total for our park grounds needs over a 20-year period based on identified deficiencies and replacing them as is in place would be about 48 million. On this one, you see the park buildings. Again, these don't refer to the grounds around them. All of our buildings obviously are in parks. These are those facilities themselves. So again, if you look at the critical, poor, fair, and good in the total in years 1 through 5, a lot of that critical actually is the International Swim Center complex there. The total in the first 5 years of needs for our buildings is about 36 million. And then when you total those out and you look at that, you get about $52 million worth of building needs. Again, most of it is sooner, and part of that is because of, again, aged infrastructure. A lot of our buildings, and some of those with the most critical need, are over 50 years of age, similar to myself. Summary, if you look at this, this is adding the 2 previous slides together saying where are the current needs. Overall, you see the combined amount is about $155.8 million worth of needs. That is with cost escalation such that we could account for how much a particular deficiency or need is going to be in an out year. So we start calculating from 2017, when is that need and what is the cost basis today for what it would cost out in the future. Again, those are life cycle needs. Parks has about 90 million, buildings about 65. Really what we want to focus on are the near term or the first 5-year horizons. If you don't do those, then things just get worse. And again, combined is about 48 million without cost escalation or 53 with cost escalation. Just to briefly mention again the ISC and CRC and cost estimates that may be out there that you've seen or that we're reporting to you. There's different methodologies of coming up with those and what you're really trying to do with those dollar amounts. Replacing in-kind as is cost estimate in the Kitchell report, you see about $30 million. That's just to fix the existing in its place exactly as it is. The Curry and Brown estimate that was provided through the contract with PFAL, in November they took the Kitchell report and did additional assessment, looked at it, and you put in contingencies and design contingencies and escalation and several other things, and you're replacing tire facilities, whereas Kitchell might keep a foundation. The Curry and Brown would basically demo the whole thing and then replace that new in that place with those items, but again, not addressing other needs. So it's just a replacement. That's about 70 million. Okay, we talked about the existing sources. Just to make mention again, because some folks, when they look at Quimby and Mitigation Fee Act, they think it could be used for everything. Again, it is the developers under Quimby in September 8th, 2015, developers get credit for the land dedication as well as the park improvements they make. So one of the ones that is coming forward that you might see and go, oh, there would be Quimby fees coming in from Lawrence Station Area Plan, from a particular developer who's working out there. That actually, for the 3.2 acres of parkland that we're going to be getting, there's about $6 million worth of improvements on that parkland that they would be reimbursed for doing. So you get a developed park at the end of it through Quimby. MFA, Mitigation Fee Act, again, that's for mitigating the impacts of the development, so that's on acquisition and development of new parkland. We don't have enough history to reasonably project. I mean, this is year 4. It kind of goes up and down, and there are, but it's not a pure cycle, or you get a trend line and say, okay, now we're able to plot that. So there's about $2 to $4 million, though, that we could project that should come in under those two. Reed and Grant on the soccer fields, just to highlight that, is that in our current climate of cost escalation and the intense bid market that we have, even the estimates that we have may be undervalued. Finally, that points to new options that we might have, and I'll turn it back over to our Assistant City Manager after questions, if you have any.
Councilmember O'Neill has a question.
Mayor, I was wondering if it was possible to go to the summary slides. It might help guide some of the questions in the conversation. It's only we have 3 summary slides at the end, if that's okay.
All right, no, thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So moving forward, what we're looking at is, and as part of the February 20th study session, we're considering a $300 million property tax. And I want to highlight, and we mentioned this at the study session on February 20th, that really means about approximately $200 million as it relates to today. And part of the discussion we wanted to have today, if that continues to move forward, kind of looking at the infrastructure needs and the presentations that we had today, is how would that funding be prioritized? And really, we're coming back to you in May, and we'd like to have some alternatives ready for you, and we're looking for some feedback that's going to help guide those alternatives. So some items for consideration as you're looking at what to consider. From a transportation perspective, certainly there's a lot of funding opportunities out there, and there's a lot of funding sources. We have some limitations and some needs, but in general, there's a lot of opportunities. I do want to acknowledge, though, that trail funding is limited, and trail funding projects tend to be fairly expensive. From a water and sewer perspective, Gary went through a lot of funded projects as well as some unfunded projects, but we do expect as we move forward that those would be funded by user rates and developer fees. We did highlight a number of projects related to flood protection, and we had that big $300 million number in front of you, but we have to acknowledge some of those are very low need and low priority, and we did have our highlight box around some of the higher priority projects, and we expect that would be in the $20 to $30 million range to really address some of those flood protection needs. And from a building perspective, a lot of buildings, some of the bigger facilities like the Civic Center project would require its own financing strategy, but we do have some idea for some fire stations in the $20 to $30 million range, including rebuilding Fire Station 5, which will allow for better operations of that facility, as well as some improvements at other existing fire stations. And of course, the council in the past, including February 20th, discussed library expansion, although we haven't developed a plan as to what that would mean. Finishing off with parks, I think Jim did a great job going over the $150 million need for existing parks. We have discussed in the past the unfunded $30 million City Place Park. And of course, we do have some limitations with the funds of how much we're going to collect and how those funds are going to be used related to Quimby and Mitigation Fee Act. And there is a large number of projects that we see as near-term needs, closer to that $50 million range or so. Finishing off with the ISC and CRC, one thing that we didn't highlight yet is that the CRC, per the Kitchell report, is actually in good condition. When you look at the 4 different conditions, they landed in good condition. Required about $1 million worth of improvements, which is pretty minimal, and definitely could use some aesthetic improvements as well. But from a building perspective, it came out well in the Kitchell analysis. One thing I did want to highlight is that is a 30 1,000 square foot building. And when you consider demolishing and rebuilding a 30,000 square foot building, you want to think in the context that that's about $1,000 a square foot. So when you're talking about demolishing and rebuilding 30,000 square feet, that means about $30 million. So I wanted to provide that context for you. In addition to that, Jim discussed the ISC. Rebuilding it would be $50 to $70 million, but we do want to acknowledge that does not include a lot of those elements that have been discussed with you and the community over the last number of years that have been very important as part of the process. And one of the key questions is, if we do have $200 million available, ultimately, how much of that funding will be dedicated to an ISC and CRC project? So next steps, we want to receive that input from you today regarding the assessment and priorities. Based on that input, we're going to develop some options and alternatives for you for May 22nd. And at that point, the council can determine if they want to continue to proceed forward with a possible November measure and kind of what the project categories would be as part of that process. So that concludes the staff presentation.
Thank you. So now we'll go with council questions. Councilmember O'Neill.
Thank you very much. And Assistant City Manager, your last slide did help me because one of my questions was about the swim center. And obviously, when I first heard of the project, it was like a $40 million project. And, I always say it's a classic example of scope creep. So would we still, even like I like what you're saying here about, can we modify the CRC? I have been an advocate for over a year now of taking the theater portion out of that project and doing something jointly in our downtown, perhaps with our partners at SCU. Would we still, is it too soon to say that we would still look at moving the pool to the other side of the park, or maybe putting the pool, there's still people who advocate that maybe the pool would be better off a swim center at, in the northern part of the city. Has any thought been, given to those alternatives, or when we come to the end of May, will you have alternatives that you will want to present at that point, specifically since that has been such a high visibility project for so many years?
Yeah, the plan is, and depending on the feedback we hear today, is to present different alternatives for you. Part of our assumption has been, because of the process and the community input, that the location of the facility would move to the new location. And probably our alternatives will include different levels of facility that you would provide. It could include something to the effect that, do you maintain the CRC and incorporate it with an addition? Can you add something to it, or do you fully replace it? And then how does that new swim center work in combination with donations and raising funds? And is it a combination effort between kind of city funds and those funds that might come in? So really what we're looking at is, from our perspective, we're going to try to bring at least a couple of options to you as to kind of what an ISC CRC project could be, depending on how much funding would be committed to it. We are assuming that it would probably be relocated based on the previous feedback and analysis that's been done, but certainly if the council's interested in an option that keeps it at the same location, we could look at that as well.
Great. So my second question has to do, and I don't know whether you or Director Teixeira would best be to answer this, but when Director Teixeira was going through the funding sources, and one of them was like donations and endowments. And I think we have a Friends of Parks and Rec, but I was wondering, do they really function sort of as a foundation? Because I'm finding, and I know in my role as president of the Santa Cruz Schools Foundation, we're changing our role in terms of really going after major grants and other donations. It's that what I have been experiencing in that other aspect of my life is that major funders are sometimes, and corporations and things, are reluctant to try to enter into agreements with governmental entities, and they want to deal with a 501c3. So I've wondered, or just was wondering, if there has been thought of, and like I said, I'm not very familiar with the Friends of Park and Rec, but do we need to look at helping some group in our community create a 501c3 that would be a much more viable vehicle for helping to bring in more substantial amounts of money? And I see our friends of PFAL in the back. Maybe they even have thoughts on that.
Certainly, and I just want to acknowledge we do have PFAL in the audience tonight listening to the presentation. One of the things in their report that they've developed for the city as they went through the ISC CRC process, to directly answer your question, for a project that looks like a new community recreation aquatic center in Central Park, that a foundational structure or some type of a new agreement between the different entities as well as those that want to assist in funding that would need to be developed. So that is one of the recommendations that we found through their analysis. The Friends of Parks and Recreation function more along the lines of a program granting organization. They do support a lot of the at-risk and needy kids who need summer camp programs and winter type programs. So that's what they've been funding over the years, and their major source of income is the Art and Wine Festival. And while what is raised is great, it doesn't rise to the level of what you're talking about in terms of significant foundation grants that could be used for capital improvements and capital projects.
Okay, great, thank you.
So, Assistant City Manager, I had just a couple questions to look at. I think, first of all, I appreciate the report because it gives us, as we drill down into all of our needs in the city, this gives us a pretty good idea of what's out there and what we need to strive for in terms of funding and strategic planning for all of this infrastructure in the future, and looking at the opportunity we may have in November to help us with some of this to really benefit the community. I think, you know, it bears this conversation. So one of the things I'm interested in is, I know the ISC project, the swim center, is an extremely expensive project and one that we really have to wrap our arms around as to some direction that we're going to go in terms of that. But I like the fact that you put here, develop a project to funds available. And I think that's what we really need to look at. So can you just remind me of the timeline, and maybe it's the PFAL representatives here, as to when are we going to make the determination, you know, what the level of tolerance is for a potential November ballot measure for Santa Clara, and sort of then work backwards as to how we prioritize all of this funding, including the swim center?
So we're, per the February 20th meeting, I think there were a couple of things that came out of the preliminary polling that was done. One was that there was not sufficient support for an ISC CRC only project. However, there was preliminary support for a more comprehensive, you know, parks, library, ISC CRC project. So what we're looking is coming back to the council in May with a recommendation of possible alternatives that could be included in the November. And at that point, we would look for authority from you to proceed with doing some polling to see how different project categories would poll with regards to kind of what a package would look like in the November ballot. So that would be the next step.
So just to be a little more clear, is your discussion on the 15th will be the inventory of projects as we've presented today, and what's the best balance towards polling and conducting community research. The following week, we'll bring back a discussion on revenue opportunities, including cannabis tax and other tax options or revenue generating opportunities on an ongoing basis. With that, you'll have all the information from our January session to authorize us to, in whatever direction you believe is the best for moving forward on community research, to do that in June. We'll come back and you'll have data that speaks to other revenue opportunities as and its relationship with what we're talking about this evening.
And just regarding the tolerance level, that 300 million and 200 million in today's dollars we're discussing today are really based on the preliminary polling that was done, that seemed to be within the tolerance level of kind of what the voters would be supportive of.
Okay, thank you. And I see there's quite a list of, projects that are very, very important. But I'm also hoping when we come back in May, we can look at library projects as well in terms of expansion of the Central Park Library and some of those other projects as well, because that's really a critical need in the community. Okay, Vice Mayor Watanabe, you're next.
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you, everybody, for the very comprehensive reports. I mean, I know a lot of work has gone into putting all of this together and really appreciate it. Having talked to some of the residents in the north side, and I know there are a couple of parks that are listed there in critical and definitely poor condition that I've met with folks about, so glad to see them on the list. But I do have a question. I know we've got, I realize and understand that funding is a big concern, but we've got a lot of projects like out there, like specific plans, things like that, in the future that we're waiting to hear back on. Is it possible that those projects could potentially provide the revenue, like through park fees, that, because we're not going to do this overnight, and those, realize those projects are not going to be built overnight, but are they potential sources of revenue?
I mean, certainly there'll be some revenue that comes from those projects. As Jim mentioned, when we do have projects like that, and sometimes there's land dedication, which we really want, as well as parking improvements associated with those. In addition to that, there's credits given for private open space. So the numbers do come down based on all those credits that they receive. Based on the last 4 years, we're estimating that from a pure dollar collection, we expect to get maybe $2 to $4 million a year. Over the next few years, once we have more data, we'll be able to determine how much money really we'll be getting from those, the Quimby Act and the Fee Act. I think the quick note on that is that when you look at the amount of needs, certainly that'll help along the way. But just considering the project like Reading Grant being $7 million over the estimate and knowing that we're going to have to borrow from future funds, that gives you a perspective that an additional funding source really is needed to catch up with the needs that we have.
Yep, thank you very much.
All right, any other council members? All right, seeing none, then we'll go to members of the public. The first member I have is Suds Jane. If you'd like to come forward, please. Good evening.
Mayor and Council, I have quite a few comments. The first is for Public Works. Concerning PCI, I know in the past we have done a lot of slurry seals, and by doing the slurry seal, we prevent the water from going down and really degrading the substrate. So I guess what I'm wondering is, are we still prioritizing slurry seal? Because we basically have no money. And then do we use metrics, such as what do other cities like Sunnyvale spend per mile of their roads? I know we have like 350 miles of roads in the city. So how does that work out per mile of roads that we have? Then, as you saw in the Mercury News today, that, these big storm events are going to happen more often. And Councilmember O'Neill did mention this, but we're potentially expecting 100-year floods to happen every 10 or 20 years. So I guess what's the city's liability? If we're not investing in flood mitigation and we flood out somebody's house, can they sue the city? Then in terms of traffic signal infrastructure, it's already been reported at council meetings that we are not charging enough to pay for traffic mitigations. So, I would love to see some smart signals to really get onto this IoT future, where signals are actually sensing how many cars there are and what the speed of the cars are, and then adjusting accordingly, because traffic is really one of our pinch points, our critical points for the city. I'm dismayed that the city doesn't invest any general funds in bicycle infrastructure. Everything comes from grants, and other cities do put their own skin in the game. So, and then for water, I'm saying, what is the impact of all of the growth that we have? We have some of these mega projects, $7 billion projects. And I didn't see any expansion of purple pipes in the plan. So I think we need to probably rely on that. Finally, for the school, for parks, are we collaborating with the schools to turf some of their fields, because we're running out of parkland? And I know there was some talk about that. And we have a desperate need for meeting rooms in the city. Today I just went to the senior center to reserve the big aerobics room and was told that I couldn't get the other room because you can only have one meeting at a time in the senior center, which is bizarre. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jane. Is there any other member of the public? Okay, staff, did you want to try and answer some of those questions or comments? Don't all jump in.
There's a series of questions and comments there. I think we'll prepare a city manager blog, and we'll just make sure we're comprehensive in our responses.
Thank you. And Mr. Jane, if you happen to have those in writing too, it'd be nice to submit so we can get a response. That's always helpful. Thank you. Oh, okay, very good. Yeah, we're used to those. Okay. I don't see any other speakers, so I think, are there any other comments from the council? Okay, seeing no other comments, then thank you very much for that presentation. Thank all of you directors here for this valuable information, and we'll see you back here on this subject again in May. Yes, 5-minute break, please, until our next item. Thank you.
You want me here? Whichever you prefer. I told you so, but I think I'll present and then I'll sit down afterwards. Yeah.
All right, welcome back, everyone. We're going to the second part of our study session today, which is the discussion on the 2019 College Football Playoff National Championship at Levi Stadium, and this will be a study session of the Stadium Authority. So here we have our Stadium Authority Manager, Jim Mercurio.
Hello, good evening. I'm Jim Mercurio, Vice President of Stadium Operations and General Manager of Levi Stadium. Happy to be here in front of you tonight to talk a little bit about this exciting game called the College Football Playoff National Championship as we bring it to Levi Stadium and to the South Bay of Santa Clara and San Jose. Very, very excited to bring this game to this region. I think today what we'll talk about is give you a little bit of background on the CFP and what that means. We'll talk a little bit more about the actual game that we'll host in January 2019. And then we'll talk a little bit about the Bay Area Host Committee, which is an entity that we set up for this game, and potentially other events down the road. Events and requirements associated with it. What you'll see the championship weekend, which is essentially what takes place in Santa Clara, and a breakdown of what happens in San Jose and some of the other smaller events, with the main event happening at Levi Stadium. We'll talk about some of the host committee required support, and then I'll finalize and end on the key dates and upcoming events that take place here at the stadium. What I wanted to do is first talk a little bit about the college football playoff, and we started to hear some kind of misconceptions or some rumblings about how the CFP kind of feels in reference to or comparative to Super Bowl and Super Bowl 50, right? Because we had Super Bowl 50 here just a few years ago, which was a tremendous success. We expect the CFP game to be just as equally successful, but I think it's important that we understand the size and scope of the event. Super Bowl 50 was certainly an iconic event. There came with it some massive responsibilities, as there are with the championship game, but the size and scope associated with this certainly don't compare. So one of the first things I absolutely wanted to get out front was there is no need, no additional media compounds in the soccer field whatsoever. Much like all of the events and the large-scale events that we have at Levi Stadium, there's no need for that space. So I wanted to make that very, very clear that we will not, by any stretch, be building anything on those fields, and we certainly wouldn't need it for this game at all. The external build-out for the game, which would be a pregame tailgate party, and I kind of get into that a little bit more, comparatively speaking to what the tailgate was for Super Bowl, which was this massive monstrosity for 10,000, 20,000 people under a tent, which took about a month to build. It's not the case here for the CFP. There are a bunch of things that'll take place. There'll be smaller tents inside the park, or half of the parking lot, but it takes about a week to build, and as compared to a month for a Super Bowl. The security footprint, though I don't want to get too much into the weeds with our security plans, but it does not require the necessary, shall I say, street closures, for example, that it did, that the Super Bowl did. For the Super Bowl, we had 4 or 5, maybe even a week in some cases, had some closed streets. It would be similar to what we do for a normal large-scale event, whether it's at a concert or if it's at a football game, likely going to be the night before that event, minimizing the amount of impacts to our community. The security footprint, again, is akin to a normal Levi Stadium event. And then the national security, special security event for Super Bowl was a SEER 1 rating, which came with it a lot of federal resources and mandates, whereas the CFP will likely be a SEER 2 or SEER 3 event in and of itself. So I wanted to kind of start there to kind of make sure that we understood that though this is a tremendously successful event, a huge number 2 event in the country in terms of scope with respect to viewership, isn't what we might have expected with respect to the Super Bowl, for example, just a few years ago. A little more background on the CFP. The College Football National Championship is one of the most, if not the most, premier event in college sports. It's hosted about 4 prior to us, and it's done through a competitive bid process, excuse me. And we were fortunately awarded that in 2015. We were awarded that the second year into it. One of the things that it's important to note is that there are cities, up to 15, I think, is who we competed against. And because of our track record, and because of the bid, because of our award-winning stadium, and recognizably so, we were chosen to host this great event in 2015 for January 7, 2019. Prior to us, it was Atlanta, Tampa, Phoenix, and Dallas, with future sites of New Orleans, Miami, Indianapolis, and Los Angeles. And one of the things that the board for the CFP made it a mandate was that there'll be 10 different cities, 10 different years. So in the next 10 years, they didn't want any repeat cities. They wanted it to be brought across 10 different major cities. Fortunate enough for us, we're one of those. Absolutely proud of that. For the first time in history, this game will be played in the Bay Area. It's expected to generate significant media attention and economic impact to the South Bay. Here's where I was telling you some of the most watched cable television in history with 33 million viewers, while in 2016 in Tampa, they estimated 3 billion in total media impressions. So we're on display. Our city, our region, our stadium, we are on display, and we're welcoming 70,000 people into this facility, into our city, and we're gonna shine, and we're gonna be proud of who we're hosting. A lot of these folks are coming from outside the region and may be here for the first time. So we're proud of that. The host committee will donate $1 million to the College Football Foundation's Extra Yard for Teachers charity, and I'll kind of get into that a little bit more. But this is one of the things that I liked about it the most, is that it's benefiting Santa Clara and Silicon Valley and the region. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, I think it was Catherine Hughes School, we were able to participate in giving a $10,000 check right off the bat. So just to kick that event off, it was pretty exciting for those teachers. The previous host committees have reported a significant impact benefit to the region, sometimes very subjective. So we're going to take a conservative look at this, but Dallas reported over 306, I think, million in economic growth to the city, and Phoenix was somewhere around 270. We're estimating 200 million. And I think we're going to be proud to deliver upon that. In fact, I know we're going to be proud to deliver on that. The Bay Area Host Committee is a 501c that was formed so that it could take on the rights and the obligations of this College Football National Championship game. The Advisory Committee proudly will feature some of the greatest. Ronnie Lott, certainly in San Francisco 49ers history, is one of the greatest in our time. And then our former U.S. Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice. So a great local flair, proudly serving on our advisory committee. There'll be much more and many more people that will join that board as that starts to come to fruition. The host committee and the 49ers have proposed an assignment agreement to the city of Santa Clara by which the Bay Area Host Committee and the 49ers would assume hosting the National Championship Week activities in the game. And upon completion of that agreement, the host committee and the 49ers would then be responsible for any and all expenses to host and execute the championship event, that game, and including the public safety, including teams that stay here. All of the costs associated with the game here in Santa Clara will be covered by the 49ers and the Bay Area Host Committee. The Bay Area Host Committee and the 49ers support the Foundation's Extra Yard for Teachers program, which with $1 million donation, leaving a lasting legacy of inspiring and empowering Bay Area teachers. So one of the things that you'll see in the presentation with the teachers is it gives us an opportunity with the CFP to really pamper teachers who, if anybody can argue against it, I'd be disappointed, but teachers are the folks that really could use a lift. And this program is certainly something that we're proud to partner with the CFP. They do a great job with it. Let's talk a little bit about game day and the championship tailgate experience at game day at Levi Stadium. That's essentially on that Monday night. Championship game is the pre-game gathering place for ticketed fans at the CFP National Championship at Levi Stadium. In partnership with the folks of Great America, Championship Tailgate will feature music, exhibits, and live ESPN broadcasts, and more. One of the things that our public safety professionals have asked us to do, and we do this for all of our events, is that we restrict it to no in and out privileges. This is only available to those that have a ticket to the game. So once you come to the game, you'll get screened, you'll go through the normal security procedures and posture, and you'll get into moving into your pregame hospitality event at the stadium. The Extra Yard for Teachers and a Taste of the Championship was a way for the CFP and the Bay Area Host Committee to really showcase their teachers and the initiatives that commit the foundations across supporting education across the country. The host committee will make $1 million donation. That Extra Yard for Teachers Summit and Lounge is a 2-day experience where I talked a little bit about the teachers being inspired, educated, and honestly pampered for those 2 or 3 days while they're in town. Proceeds of the Taste of the Championship will support the College Football Playoff Foundation and its Extra Yard for Teachers platform. What this event does is allows us to circulate, and kind of showcase a lot of the local restaurants, the local flair here in the Bay Area, while celebrating teachers from across the United States. This is one of the events that the city manager and the assistant city manager actually joined us with briefly while we were in Atlanta to review and get a preview of what the college football game is all about. The Playoff Fan Central and AT&T Playoff Playlist Live, these are events that will take place in San Jose. One of the things that the college football place does, or college football playoff does, is really try to impact the cities as often as they can. This was in Atlanta next to the facility, but we wanted, in case you started to hear about this, this is two different events. One is an interactive experience that gives thousands of fans and Bay Area residents the opportunity to be part of the championship game in a family-friendly environment. So kind of like an NFL experience, if any of you that went to the Super Bowl would be akin to seeing. And the Playoff Playlist Live is a series of free outdoor concerts that, if you look at some of the past headliners, included Usher, John Mellencamp, and Darius Rucker, to name a few. In addition, ESPN plays a huge role in broadcasting this constantly for the 2 or 3 days while they're in town. One of the reasons why these events not necessarily in Santa Clara is the infrastructure is not here. You need to have a little bit more space to accommodate this, but nonetheless, this is something that we think will be a great event. Some media events that take place on Media Day and the Media Party and Media Operations also primarily will take place in San Jose. There are some potential opportunities as we finalize some of the build-outs here in the next couple of months of tying in the Santa Clara Convention Center and some of these potential opportunities with credentials and things of that nature. And as we get through that, we can know a little bit more. But this is really a one-day event in terms of the Media Day, where the players and both teams actually arrive. They'll go at an arena space is what they like to see, similar to that of what you saw at a Super Bowl, where the two teams come in and they get interviewed by different media that are here for the day. Fans are allowed to watch in and join and listen to their favorite players while listening to the interviews on a free headset and absorb more than 1,000 journalists that come to town to actually work this event. Some of the support elements associated with the bid will require us to market, volunteer, and host events. So if there's an opportunity here for any of the charity events or folks that you work with, the gong.
Talk
It reminded
faster.
me of the Gong Show. I was waiting for the dancing bear to come out and get me. What I was referring to here, there's a great opportunity for the board and other city agencies and the public to actually look for folks that may want to volunteer. They're going to be recruiting 2,000 plus volunteers to help us with wayfinding and different transportation and hospitality operations between the region, the hotels, the streets, in and around Santa Clara and San Jose. If there's any opportunity for any of the charity organizations that you work with, we'd love for you to be a part of that and go to bayarea2018.com, and there'll be opportunities for all of you and all of the public if they're interested in volunteering. But it's generating and building anticipation and engaging the community to produce all these different events in and around both Santa Clara and San Jose. Transportation and practice facilities, one of the things in the bid that we had to do is maintain that we would take care of the ground transportation for the teams, game officials, CFP groups, and the media as they are here and arrive the week prior to the game. We've identified Stanford and San Jose State Universities as facilities that meet the requirements set forth by the CFP, and the two teams will stay here in Santa Clara. So proud to announce that they'll be staying here in Santa Clara hotels. The events are located in the South Bay with hotels, expenses, and meals and meeting rooms all need to be covered. These expenses as well will be covered by the San Francisco 49ers as a result of the assignment agreement language that we're trying to work with the city manager and team on. According to the Santa Clara Convention Visitors Bureau, we are upwards of 7,500 rooms now, I think, that are dedicated in Santa Clara that have been blocked for this event. So that's a tremendous win as we look at that. So as we keep getting those types of numbers in, we will advise, but we are absolutely pleased that if you look to the right of that slide, of all the different rooms committed for those days. Some key dates in the calendar as it comes about. May 3rd is probably, you know, I wouldn't say the biggest, but it's certainly the operational, what we call the operational kickoff meeting. It's where we bring in all of our assets to bear. Anybody that has any responsibility with operating or working a game or an event at Levi Stadium will participate in these operations meetings. We have these regularly. This will take place on May 3rd, where we'll go through every single thing we know to date with respect to how the event may look, the size and scope, the traffic, start working on traffic plans and things of that nature. 9 months prior to the event. We just got our schedule 2 days ago or 5 days ago for the 49ers. We'll start doing that same thing as we start to understand the schedule associated with that too. There's a fall kickoff luncheon that we'll be sure that we'll get invites out to the board and to other city staff. And then in November, there's a large-scale production meeting where all facets of the CFP come in and really display kind of the almost final draft of what we can expect for January. So that's one region, that's one goal, that's one champion, and that's collectively the 49ers, the city of Santa Clara, the Stadium Authority, really proud and excited to host this game. This is going to be great for our region, and we're looking forward to hosting it. I'm going to be available for any other questions. I know you have a presentation too afterwards, if that's what you like.
So I'm going to wait for the presentation to be called up, and then we'll shift into questions, if that's fine.
I'd like to hear the presentation. I see Councilmember Mahan, can you wait for that? Thank you. Okay.
So I just want to thank the stadium manager for an excellent and thorough presentation on the event, and begin with the city of Santa Clara is honored. I'm waiting for my slide, but I'll just get started.
Okay, thank you.
To host the college football playoff national championship. And I think I'm in full agreement with what the stadium manager just said. This is an excellent example of our region's prestige as well as our ability to attract major events. I think it's particularly the key ingredient here is Santa Clara and Levi Stadium as the right venue to host such an event. And I want to shift our attention with that in mind to just public resources as well as event requirements that I think are necessary as we begin tackling this over the next couple of months. So just to summarize the event summary, the items or events that will happen in the city of Santa Clara are, as mentioned, we will host the teams. There will be some media events, media operations, and alumni activities, the game day and championship tailgate, and of course, the national championship game. Below listed are the events that will take place in the city of San Jose. They've been thoroughly covered, and so I just leave them there as an inventory of events for you to reference if you need to as part of our questions and answers. It does happen very quickly indeed, from the semifinal games to January 4th, the playoff, up to the January 7th game. We will, as soon as we learn about the teams, everybody will continue to mobilize and get branding and marketing out. And it is a tight schedule, as we all observed collectively in the city of Atlanta. For sake of time and wanting to get to questions and answers, I'll just cover these slides. And of course, our chiefs are here to answer any questions and supplement any logistics with respect to the special event. From a public safety standpoint, well, let me just start with there's 3 areas that we are focused on is public safety, transportation, and parking. Each of these require public agency coordination. We'll walk through. I think it's important to mention that the good news is the city is well poised and positioned to deliver on these events, just given the historical background and the number of events that have already been hosted through Levi Stadium. With that in mind, as already mentioned, we did attend the championship to get some field information and intelligence as to logistics and planning and how the event needs to be delivered in Atlanta earlier this year. We're looking forward to the kickoff meeting on May 3rd, where we'll begin regular meetings, as you see ongoing as the third bullet, between our public safety departments, meeting once to twice per month to really begin all of the logistics and details, as already discussed. From a public safety standpoint, I just wanted to call to your attention on the slides here the public agencies that require coordination. And as mentioned, that has already been done several times, and it would take the same approach for a large-scale event under models already established within the city side. Transportation, this is a charge of our stadium manager, who serves as lead and implements and, of course, makes adjustments, but does look at our transportation management and operations plan to make sure that details are consistent with those plans. I do mention in the second bullet the transportation agencies and traffic coordination of other public agencies that are required for your reference as well. On the parking side, again, this is an area that's covered by the stadium manager. The information of the parking lots and the available parking slots is disclosed here on your slide. And as we all know, our police department is responsible for any parking lot response or calls. So next steps, we talked about the May 3rd kickoff. I wanted to start as we begin to get more robust planning, just give you updates either through the board meetings or through city manager biweekly, just to give you a heads up in terms of planning and where we're headed. And also notice that here on this, there are some site visits coming up by CFP, and I wanted to also have the board aware of those site visits, as you may be invited to some of the events or some of the planning or just some of the briefings or some of the opportunities to meet with CFP individuals or representatives. So the next area are how are we going to do this through agreements? And there's really 2 agreements at hand that will get us to a successful event. And I just want to talk through a couple of various issues that I think are important that will land us in a successful position. But just as background, as already mentioned, there was a bid that was submitted by Manco, and the good news is we were selected to host the event. Unfortunately, it appears through just discussion and record that the last disclosure was to former Stadium Authority Executive Director Julio Fuentes. And at the time, there was a loss associated with the bid, but to my understanding that there has been no formal discussions at the board level, and so it's my duty to bring that information to you. What's important here is this isn't about the event, this is about our agreements and some of the limitations within our agreements. And I want to acknowledge that our existing agreements do not contemplate an event with these types of financials. And handling them would be unfavorable within our existing contractual terms. The good news is that Manco has proposed a solution, and it is through the 49ers backstopping the financial losses. And it is an area that we as the Stadium Authority staff need to learn a little bit more about as we continue to move forward. Assigning the CFP National Championship game agreement to the host committee, I think, is the prudent step to protect the Stadium Authority of any losses or adverse fiscal impacts of holding this particular event at the Levi Stadium. And we'll walk through some of the scenarios. As already mentioned, the Bay Area Host Committee is a newly formed organization. It's a nonprofit mutual benefit corporation that would become the entity that would manage and be financially responsible for the CFP National Championship under the assignment agreement. More good news, but that both Manco and myself, the Executive Director of the Stadium Authority, recommend that the event should be assigned to the Bay Area Host Committee. And I just wanted to walk through some terms that I think the board should consider, and the terms that I think are in our best interest to address any issues related to this event that we'll go through. So why are we doing this? And we look at our existing agreements through NFL and non-NFL events. And the first is that this event does not qualify as an NFL event, and that under those terms it would be limited to 10 NFL games and the Super Bowl. This is not one of either. The second is if we look at it through the lens of a non-NFL event, I've already mentioned that without that there would be unfavorable or some financial impacts. And when we evaluated the potential financial impacts against your approved board budget, there could be a combination of some amendments that would be required in order to absorb the event, such as a reduction in the approved schedule to pay down debt, a drawdown through existing lines of credit, reduction in the necessary city support services to manage the stadium, or potential non-performance rent to the city in the estimated amount as approved in your budget of $2.7 million. The assignment agreement approach that we are presenting, and you'll be presented with the actual language, I think is the best approach because it isolates all of the negative impacts. So this is the Stadium Authority approved balanced budget, and it, of course, was just before you as adopted on March 27th. In coordination with the stadium manager. And it's important to note here that a budget is just a projection of how expenditures are based on trends and information are projected for council's review. In our cover letter, we did mention that there were some risks to the budget, and particularly areas of arbitration and litigation that would cause for us to have to open the budget if there is an adverse impact. And so with that in mind, we put forward these numbers with certain disclosures, the CFP being one, that it still needed to be addressed as we were learning additional information. But nevertheless, you have an approved budget, and they're included in it are transfers out, and I'll talk about these numbers in the next slide, but it is a matter of fact that our revenues do exceed our expenses. But I do want to go through our non-NFL expenses, but I do want to go through some of the line items that I think are particularly important. As part of the transfer out, you have some capital expenditures and some debt service in that line item. And then as part of all other expenses, you have SBL sales and services, Stadium Authority general and administrative costs, as well as utilities. So the estimated cost or loss for this is roughly about $12 million. It's estimated, it's projected, much like the budget is, and the numbers will true up after we get through actuals. But in order to absorb that through the non-NFL lens, there are a number of amendments that would be required in order to evaluate, or that the board would have to be required to consider and eventually approve. One is, of course, the performance rent, which I've already mentioned earlier. And then through a combination of certain budget amendments, we would have to yield roughly $9.3 million to make sure that we meet the trigger of no losses to the Stadium Authority and make sure that we have a balanced budget. The other risks that I mentioned in the cover letter and as mentioned now through other outcomes of arbitration and litigation are not factored into this budget balancing exercise. So for our proposed terms, there's really about just four. They're frankly pretty simple, and one is that the host committee will be responsible for all costs and expenses in connection with the game, including any expenses that are pre, during, and after the event cost. And the sub-bullets just detail out more what we're specifically referring to, and this is public safety cost up to double time, planning cost, traffic and code enforcement. We do capture no expenses beyond what's already covered by permits. Any costs associated with teams to stay at the hotels and any assumptions related to our duties to support that. And bottom line is, in short, we say we believe that the best term is no public, and as consistent with your agreements in Measure J, that no public service support expenditures will be absorbed by the Stadium Authority or the City of Santa Clara. For the second is, if there is any net income to this, that it should come back to the Stadium Authority or the city's general fund, just as it would flow through the management agreements. And that we require a complete accounting of all revenue and expenses provided to the Stadium Authority through an independent third-party auditor at no cost to the Stadium Authority, as well as the audit contract should be managed by the Stadium Authority, either myself or the auditor, if hired by then. We also have an auditing provision in the venue agreement, which we'll walk through. And I think it's important to disclose that based on the status of the Bay Area Host Committee as a nonprofit organization, it can't operate with a deficit, and therefore we would want to make sure that we have a full understanding of the backstop if required, as part of the agreement and audit. So this is just a diagram. I've mentioned a lot of different agreements, a lot of different organizations. This is what I think is a simple diagram of the structure of the agreement of what we're proposing. And it starts with the College Football Conference and Manco entering into the agreement. Their request to assign it to the Bay Area Host Committee. Through our current agreements that exist, it does require approval by the Stadium Authority Board. With a contribution of the projected losses through the 49ers team. On the venue agreement, it's a relatively standard and consistent with past practice. I think what's important here is there are some provisions with respect to parking. The city's fee will be charged and paid to the city. So for sake of time, I'll just go through these slides very quickly. In short, the surcharge will be included. And at the end, the last bullet you have there is the audit provision. So for next steps, we'll be back on May 29th with agreements that we hope to present for your consideration. We will start monthly updates through my blog or through your meeting schedule, and we will also look at the recent March 27th motion to inform any of the logistics or monthly planning or through public safety lens what we may need to inform differently as to our deployment or support for those services. So with that, we can begin to take questions.
Okay, thank you, and probably realize we'll probably extend past the 7 o'clock for the council meeting. I assume there'll be, I already have a list of people asking questions. Our first is Authority Member Mahan.
Thank you, and I first want to congratulate the staff of the 49ers and our own staff city manager and her team for working so collaboratively to try to get a solution to this, because I think it's kind of exciting to have this game in Santa Clara. But I just want to make a couple of things clear to me and clarify them, and I don't know if properly direct to the city manager or to Mr. Mercurio. But as I understand these proposed agreements, it would take away all of the risk from not only our city's general fund, but also our share of the stadium authority funding, so there would be no cost to the city.
That's true. That's absolutely the terms that we have set.
And then we're going to use some of our facilities for some of the events, and will those generate revenue to the city, you know, sort of this outside revenue as far as hotel nights, TOT, sales tax, those kinds of things? Convention center, is our convention center being used for any activities?
So the rooms that were mentioned as being blocked off, we would collect the normal TOT that's already applied. And I understand Lisa is here. There are some events happening at the convention center, I think, or there has been some reservations made. And any general revenue that's obtained through the normal reservation process and booking process, if there is any to come back to the city, would come back.
And what does it mean that the ESPN campus is going to be in Santa Clara?
Want me to get that? Is this on?
Yeah.
So ESPN has a tremendous amount of support staff, and so they'll be anchoring here in Santa Clara. But you'll have a number of sets, if you were, ESPN sets, like live broadcast sets. But their home base will be here in Santa Clara, their homes and their operational facilities. The biggest of which would be the game itself, the number of cameras that it would take to broadcast this game live, and from the actual championship tailgate, surpasses even the Super Bowl. So that's why they say that their campus will be in Santa Clara.
I see.
Yeah.
And so how will things be actually funded? Will the city have to front any money, or will all the money come from the team initially? So is it a case that we have to front some funds and get paid back? Or is it this team's going to front all the costs as they come along? Or is that part of the agreement that's going to come to us?
You start and I'll finish.
I don't think we've worked through all the details.
Okay.
I mean, essentially, this would be an assignment of an agreement for the game to the host committee. The host committee is a nonprofit, so
Yes.
even though we have in principle the understanding that the 49er team would quote-unquote backstop whatever net losses there would be out of holding the event through this agreement, we really haven't had much of a dialogue about how that money would come into the host committee, and obviously the host committee would be looking to other sources of revenue in holding the event, and maybe you could talk a little bit more about that, but I don't know the answer in terms of how exactly the backstopping would occur.
Sure, and I think as we go to look forward to solidifying that language, we'll get closer. But I think to the crux of your question, really the only thing that the city may front, if you will, would be public safety costs because they are your employees. And so as you would do for any other event, you would then give us all the costs associated with that, and then we would pay those.
And then that actually brings up another question I had. How about other staffing costs from the city side? You know, whether it be the city manager's office, city clerk's, I mean, whatever departments may be involved in you know, preparing for this event and working on this event. How did will those staff costs be included in what's reimbursed to the city?
We would. I'm sorry.
So we've already established a code. So when we work on this, we're able to code, and as we traveled, we're able to track that time. As I mentioned, in one of the requirements is pre, during, and post. It is an area that we would need to come to terms with as part of our discussions with the stadium manager and help them understand the amount of staffing involved, including time here from this table.
Okay, so you are anticipating that all of those costs would be covered, and so there would be certainly no loss either monetarily or time-wise.
Right. We've been clear to say pre, during, and post.
Yes, thank you. And how much, is there any anticipation of how much revenue this will bring into the city in terms of outside sources, TOT, sales tax, those kinds of things? You know, tourist spending and on that sort of thing?
There was a figure that was thrown out by the stadium manager. What we still are very much in process of understanding is because the event takes place in two different locations, San Jose and Santa Clara, the distribution of potential revenue or impact to each city. Well, we can probably speak in terms of region, the details around based on the compilation of events in San Jose and Santa Clara, what exactly are the financials? We don't have that information yet, nor may we. We would probably have to do additional work to do an economic analysis.
Yeah, and I think what I would add to that is when you look at the Dallas statements, you look at Phoenix and the economic vitality that they've experienced in those regions. They 300 million. We're estimating 200 million. In terms of the 7,500 rooms and the TOT benefit and all the sales tax associated with that, and in and around the city, it's a little hard for us to estimate that. But I would say to you that it is a positive benefit to you because there's no expense, no risk to the city, and any expenses that would all be a positive economic benefit to you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Authority Member Caserta.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Questions, whether it's to staff or Mr. Mercurio. You mentioned that Dallas was a number of 300 million. Why are you saying 200 million then?
Well, we're just taking a conservative approach based on the event. So if you look at even in Dallas at that first kickoff, that was the first CFP event. It has grown in size and scope over the course of the past 4 or 5 years as it comes to us. Those reports are estimated, they're subjective at times. But I think when you look at the past history, that's probably at the lower level. And so we wanted to, we didn't want to overstate it. And I think at 200 million in economic benefit, that's a huge shot in the arm to the South Bay and certainly to Santa Clara and San Jose.
You mentioned the synergy. Can you tease that out a little more from impressions of ESPN saying Santa Clara to what happened in Dallas because of this moving forward? Can you talk about that a little more?
Well, I think what I would say is these types of events not only are important for the city just for this event, this kind of event attracts other promoters, other cities, other vendors, other opportunities for the city of Santa Clara and Levi Stadium in particular when we're looking to market Levi Stadium in Santa Clara, right? This is becoming, and arguably already is, the crown jewel of stadiums across this nation. We've already been named the Stadium of the Year. And so events like this help in that regard. Bringing 33 million or 3 billion impressions of media stamps about this game and where it's played, in the city in which it's played and it's housed, is priceless. So I think when you look at the opportunities we have together as a region, as a city, as an authority, as a stadium, as a team, working collaboratively to bring 70,000 people on their feet and celebrating this event, I think there's nothing but great things that can come of it.
You mentioned, and it'll be a little commentary into a question, I think many of us on this dais ferociously campaigned for Measure J for just events like this. And if there was no Levi Stadium, there would be no event that's happening next year. But my question is, and the city manager did a good job of mentioning region, can you kind of bifurcate why some events will be in Santa Clara, i.e. the ESPN campus, and some will be in San Jose? And are we capturing all that we can in Santa Clara? Or what else can we do to support you in that?
Well, sure. In fact, I'd even argue that the development across from us on the golf course is in large part to this stadium being here as an anchor to providing additional opportunities for tenants to come to Santa Clara and develop here. So I think there's no question in my mind that what Levi Stadium has brought is a positive in that regard. In terms of bifurcating, it's similar to what we did with NHL. It's similar to what we did with WWE, those types of events where the infrastructure, unfortunately, at this time, can't support the size and scope right now. After the development across the street, there may be an opportunity there where we can host some of those things. You don't have an arena, so sometimes that can, that size and scope of a need. The convention center, unfortunately, it's just not as big as it needs to be to accommodate some of those things. And it's not a jam on something. It's just the reality of it that it's just not as big as some of these promoters are asking and desiring. So anytime that we can kind of work off one another, what you guys can do to help us is collectively, and we can help each other, is really again focus on this asset and promoting great things as a result of it.
And moving forward, and this question will be directed to staff, I really hope after this event we can get an autopsy on, hey, if we had a larger convention center, we had more infrastructure, what are the things that we need moving forward to capture as much possible dollars in Santa Clara? So I hope my colleagues on the dais agree with that. And that leads me to the question, when I envisioned Super Bowl being here a few years ago, I know the NFL usually has, certain stadiums, weather-wise, et cetera, in February in a rotation. I sure hope we're still on that rotation. Is that similar to college football, where there'll be a rotation as well?
Yeah, so I'm certainly hopeful. So let me tell you that I'm absolutely certain, without a shadow of a doubt, that the NFL is paying attention to how we respond to the college football playoff and how that event kicks off. Given the size and magnitude of it, will they and do they want to come back to Santa Clara and Levi Stadium? How we handle that will be important. How we all collectively respond to that will be important. When I tell you words matter, words really matter. Action really matters. With respect to the CFP coming onto the circuit, for the first 10 years, they've said they don't want to be on a circuit. They want to expose other large cities and stadiums. Once they get past that 10 year, they would go back to, I would think, a circuit, which was when we'd want to make sure that we were on that hunt.
And my understanding is, if we look at precedent, the last consecutive years, there's been at least one team from the SEC, primarily Alabama. And in the South, along with NASCAR, this is religion, as they don't have professional teams in a lot of those areas. So you're talking about a huge geographic base of folks that have deep alumni in pockets that will be spending money here, and the experience that our workers and teachers will have. Can you elaborate on that a little?
I think you actually absolutely hit it on the head. I think what you'll notice, without committing to who might be in the game, because you don't know who's going to be in the game, but there are a tremendous amount of people who root for their school, with whom they have attended. Right? They bleed red and gold, or they bleed whatever college colors they were, and they support. And so they're all rooting for their team to get here and showcase on that night. So to bring it to the Bay Area, it's pretty special. I can't tell you how excited the CFP is and how college football fans across the country will be when we open our doors to them.
Yeah, and look, I've said this before, and I don't mean to editorialize a little. We are a region as well, and we want to capture as much money as we can in the city of Santa Clara. But this is something that should be celebrated region-wide. And just staff, so we can tie this bow for me, so I understand this. There's going to be millions and millions of dollars. A conservative figure is about $200 million. I think it'll be way north of that. The costs are going to be backstopped by our partner, and we will have some out-of-pocket costs with public safety in the beginning that they've just memorialized that they will be paying for. So there's no risk on our end. Am I understanding that?
That's the solution that together Manco and myself have come to and what we're working towards for May 29th.
I want to thank everyone. This is exactly what 59% of voters were looking for with Measure J. Thank you.
Okay, Authority Member O'Neill.
Thank you very much. Executive Director, so maybe you can help me here. I'm trying to understand the financial model behind this event. So we have one of the slides that you had, the CFP lost $12 million. So I'm kind of curious. So, and it looked like initially that was all going to flow to the Stadium Authority. I mean, so are all the entities involved in this game losing money? Was that the total loss? Was that our share of the loss, or was that? It seems a little strange to me.
I can't speak to the financial model with the $12 million estimated loss. I think that's better for the stadium manager. I can only speak to the fact that if we were to absorb it as a non-NFL event, it would be problematic within your approved budget. And I can speak to the solution that we have in a diagram here of that what we think is the most prudent approach to absorb these losses, have this very prestigious event and move forward.
Because, I mean, so there is some language in there about the, so I'm looking at the assignment agreement. So we talk about, we normally have our ticket surcharge, and we're supposed to be getting a percentage of, the concessions and a number of things, because, we're looking at these events as events where we make money. And, my only concern about this is that, okay, maybe we're covering costs, but are we really making any money on it? I'm assuming, I mean, it seems fun, I'm not sure, maybe Mr. Mercurio could speak to this, but if the model is, the host committee is a nonprofit and they're not supposed to be losing any money, I can't imagine that the 49ers would want to go into something and lose money on it. So it's kind of like, well, I'm just a little curious as to the model, as to who's making the money here, so like, and as I said, I'm concerned about, are we losing opportunities? And let me just make a couple other points. So also, one of the things that we talked about, that hopefully this game won't have as many impacts on the region for as long a period of time as the Super Bowl did, because one of the things that we are blessed with currently, and for, depending on which forecast you see of the market, that we have a very robust economy here on our own. And there is an argument that can be made that with the Super Bowl, and I actually, just anecdotally, like somebody that I know that owned a business in downtown San Jose said that he actually made less money during the Super Bowl period than he did normally, because a lot of other people stayed away. And our hotels are occupied at a very high rate during the week. We do have obviously some fall off, Sunday nights maybe not as bad, but definitely Friday, Saturday nights. So, one of the things that we always need to be careful about when we're looking at some of these economic impact analyses is to look at what is the base that we're working from, which may be different than a lot of these cities that aren't necessarily having hotels that are surrounding a stadium that are full because of the presence of companies such as NVIDIA and Intel and Applied Materials and Cisco and, yada, yada, yada. So I just want to make sure that we're bringing that into the equation, that we're recognizing that hotels and restaurants and things around here are full a great deal of the time anyhow, And so that's one of the things I'd like to make sure is that we make clear to our ongoing business clients that come to our city, that patronize the convention center, that go to our hotels, and that are paying our TOT and the Tourist Improvement District costs and all of that, that this will have minimal impact and make sure that we're not seeing other cancellations occur around the time of the game. But like I said, I'm still kind of curious as to how we arrived at I appreciate, I very much, believe that we thoroughly need to make sure that we're not losing money. But I'm just kind of curious as to whether we ended up with the loss all in our bucket, and if it then precludes us from actually having events that we're making money on. If the model of the event is such that it precludes most of the parties involved from making a profit, because we aren't a capitalist society.
So I can't proclaim to be able to do a regional economic impact analysis with actuals after the event. I think it would be very difficult to establish the base just based on this dynamic region. But certainly those are follow-up studies that we could get economists or people with that expertise to delve in and look at these events. I think what's important, though, is to acknowledge that the structure, and I can speak for my own knowledge and research on this, and perhaps the stadium manager wants to add more, but these numbers here are not uncommon. And in my research and discussions, there are other public entities that have provided the backstop. In this case, we're just not providing the backstop. And so there is another entity that is filling in the position that in other past events, public entities have provided for. What I can tell you, though, is in our proposed terms, we do have shared revenue or shared net income if there is something to be gained, and we do have strong audit provisions that we are putting forward as a term, so that if there is any financial information that is to our benefit, where we can experience some revenue in this instance, then certainly we would want to capture that.
Thank you. Authority Member Davis.
For you. When you first started your conversation, you kind of said that this wasn't as large as Super Bowl because of the venue. We weren't going to have as many tents or whatever. So what was your projection on, you said smaller uses of tents? Where would they be in that Great America parking lot? I mean, how are we doing this? Like, red button.
Yeah, green, I get confused with green. Green, go. Essentially, I think if I was to outline for you, looking from the side entrance of Great America, where they have their new pavilion that they've built out, from that kind of fence line, maybe a third to a half of the parking lot or so in that area would be secured by what we call K-rails or Jersey barriers for security measures. And that space there would be where they would, what they call activate, CFP would activate a pregame hospitality event. I don't know how many tents that they made there. It may not be tents, right? If it's beautiful weather, we might not. It might be a little bit more open air. But that kind of space in that area there will be where that pregame hospitality of anybody that has a ticket will have access to that. Once they get, and then we would hold them along the front end, and then once the stadium gates opened, then they would be able to go in freely without having to move forward. So you do your security checks and things of that nature closer to the main entrance of Great America. I hope I'm explaining it to you. And then once you get in, that kind of third or half or whatever it is to the parking lot would be where they would activate.
Okay,
and that's what we have to work with CFP and their teams as they develop what's inside that. We just know that there's a box and a perimeter that we need to secure and manage, and then they'll start plugging kind of different types of sponsor activations or things of that nature.
Okay, so when the city manager went to Atlanta to witness all of this,
yeah,
what was the scope of services that was required by us, with this bid? I mean, what is it that we need to do? I mean, the banners, I mean, because it's, to me, this is college football, this is their Super Bowl. And these people, and Councilmember Caserta alluded to that, this is religion. And these people will come here, this is diehard. So I'm really concerned about what was the scope that they actually in Atlanta said, what do you need in your city to facilitate this event?
I'm happy to answer that. I think what they said was a strong connection with your city manager and your building department for permitting.
Permitting, okay.
So, which would be similar to the process that we would go through for another large-scale event that we would have, right?
Like a concert or something, but this is a little bit bigger.
Yeah, so it would be those same folks that go through those same process for a large-scale event, making sure your widths and the aisles are right, that you're using the appropriate tie-downs, that your structural integrity is there, things of that nature. And that's one of the reasons why we wanted to do the kickoff in May, so that we can identify as much of those things as possible and pulling in some of those folks, and we've invited those folks to that meeting as well.
Okay, and then you also made a comment, you need less security, and I'm kind of thinking.
No, those words didn't come out of my mouth.
Well, I wrote them down. Less security, you said less security, it's in a larger, it's like a large-scale event.
So well, one, I wouldn't discuss security measures openly in the public, but I would tell you in terms of a footprint, you would have less security fencing or closure or a perimeter.
Okay.
That's what I meant. By no means would I talk about more or less security in an open setting. I don't want the bad guys knowing our plan, right?
Okay, so the anticipation of 70,000 people, similar to an NFL event,
Yeah.
okay. And the 200 million you anticipated coming in, was that what Atlanta made?
I don't know
In the region, or?
I don't know that we've been able to get that yet, but that is a great point, and we can certainly look as we track it to see what their impacts are. I know that the city manager at one point in time had gotten some of the commitments that the city themselves have underwritten for this sort of an event.
I would really like to know what their impact, what they had in the region. What was resources, what came in, what went out. I'm pretty sure that a lot of those people track that stuff, so.
Well, I would say that the only difference, well, maybe not the only difference, but one big difference in Atlanta was that they had to do a different model because of the footprint. If you remember, the footprint of what they called championship tailgate wasn't as sizable because they didn't have the footprint that we have. So they had to do a few different things, but in Tampa, in Phoenix, in Dallas, they were able to go to their traditional model. But nonetheless, it's still, and then I would say the other thing is, which was probably kind of disappointing to the teams, to the city and to the hotels in Atlanta, is that the proximity of those teams, many people didn't fly, many didn't stay, they drove because it was within hours away. Now, don't make me go on record in saying that one of our teams locally isn't going to make it, but I just don't, I'll leave it at that.
And then the other thing, Councilmember Mahan brought up the TOT, and Councilmember O'Neill brought up another good question. We are basically an engine driver, Silicon Valley for the nation, and Monday through Thursday, we're booked with tech companies. So this is a Monday night game, and so my concern was the impact of what was going to happen with how we going to get these people in and get them out. I know that a lot of tech workers get a little irked, especially if they have to leave or, So have we reached out to the tech companies and had conversation with them? Because once again, this is the first time we're kind of getting all this stuff. So I wanted to know what the reach out was on that with the TOT, because I know it says in your report here that the Convention Center and the CBB have already booked 7,400 rooms, already blocked them off.
Right.
So that question, I know that question was asked of you, so is that true? I mean, do you know that those are blocked off?
They've set aside these rooms,
right.
And it's no different than, say, a conference being booked on a week that, another company wants to do a convention in the area. So I think the hotels are overly excited about it, and we certainly are. We're certainly pleased.
Okay, and another thing is, it seems like there's a lot more events, like you said, we're kind of in San Jose, and it seemed like the debt was in our side, but what is the debt associated with San Jose?
You have no debt on your side whatsoever.
And San Jose has no debt? Nobody has any debt?
I'm speaking to you in Santa Clara. Santa Clara has absolutely zero. The 49ers have underwritten and offered to underwrite that.
Can you tell me who's on the host committee?
Other than
your advisory two people?
And the advisory folks, I'm sorry, I do not have a list of all the folks on. I'd be happy to come back to you with that.
Supply that with the city manager?
Absolutely happy to do that.
I'd like to know who's on the host committee. And the other question I had was, I already talked about the Monday night issue. Just bear with me. I just kind of write all these little notes down. Okay, so I think what we're trying to, under the city manager's report, was so that it would not impact our general fund, and this is basically a non-NFL event that's kind of moving to a host community event. So what I wanted to know was, are we going to have a signed agreement and maybe a separate account so that the money is not commingled anywhere? Because to me, we're separating things here.
So let me just make this, very clear. There is no mechanism ever to allow the city or its general fund to be negatively affected, right? So secondly, what I would say is through the prudent steps that outlined in that agreement, we would go through the necessary language in that agreement to ensure that there is no costs to the city of Santa Clara through the audit procedures that she talked about, through the language in that agreement. Yes, we are confident that there will be no expenses, no risk, no losses to the city of Santa Clara.
So is there a way of, and I know you have the backstop, but is there a way of putting a separate account together that is where the money can be drawn off of, or, I mean, is that legally,
Well, the entity that we're assigning it to is a nonprofit. So the nonprofit, I assume, will have its own accounts and
Okay.
bank accounts, and we're expecting to get full transparency of all of the nonprofit's financials.
Okay, so they're in agreement to keep the money separate and also be audited and just separate everything
Well,
from what we do? Yes.
That's what we're trying to work out right now,
Okay.
is all those details.
That was one of my questions, and public safety was fully covered. That was, you addressed that?
Yep.
Okay. That's it. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Vice Chair Watanabe?
Thank you. I've got a bunch of questions as well and scattered around, but just to go back to what Councilmember Davis was talking about, there is a statement in the beginning stating that the security footprint will be significantly less, akin to a normal Levi Stadium event with no expansion necessary. However, the event is compared to a Tier 2 or Tier 3 event. I mean, would that not necessitate, higher homeland security or coverage?
So let me answer it this way. Every large-scale event at Levi Stadium, at its, I don't want to get overly, the amount of detail that is put into our security planning with this city, with the city of Santa Clara Police Department, Fire Department, EMT, FBI, Secret Service, these are all representatives that are here on a normal large-scale event at Levi Stadium. So without getting any further into our security planning procedures, what I mean to tell you is the size and scope of that perimeter that you may have seen at the Super Bowl extended out much greater than what our perimeter does today. For this CFP event, the perimeter is the same or greater than the NFL's best practices and the Levi Stadium's best practices for security, which is secured by and sponsored by the Department of Homeland Security and our Safety Act certification. Okay, so what that means is, without getting into any greater detail with our security planning, you won't see the security perimeter extended as far out as you may have seen for the Super Bowl.
Because I was surprised when you mentioned, like, for instance, that Tasman would not be shut down as long as it was for the Super Bowl, for instance. And I'm kind of surprised at that because, again, I would imagine you want to secure the premises and the parameter of the stadium because of the notoriety of the event. And so do you estimate that it would just be 1 or 2 days that Tasman would be shut down?
So I think we would work with the chief's office, the city manager's office as well, but I also say to you, we are considerate and conscious of the impacts of the city and the everyday life, right? And so there are ways in which we can implement our security procedures in such a way that maintains the safety and security of those attending, as well as those that are in the community around us. So what we're trying to do is use smart technology. There's a other techniques and that we have implemented since Super Bowl 50 that we would be engaging in for this event, and we do for our games at Levi Stadium and events at Levi Stadium.
Great. And that won't have as much impact on the Creek Trail, right?
And it would be similar to what we would do for large-scale events. That's right.
Let me ask you about media, for instance. I noticed you mentioned that you won't be using the soccer park. I mean, an event like this still does bring in a lot of media coverage. Where would they expect to be setting up their?
So one of the things that we're doing inside the stadium is actually creating space in the workspace within some of the areas within the stadium itself. So we'll be clearing out some storage rooms and things of that nature and transforming that media space. The difference in CFP and Super Bowl is Super Bowl media was here for a week. They're only here for game day. And so that's why when you talked about, when Councilmember Mahan talked about their headquarters or things of that nature, they're at a different place. For game day is all we have to provide for. At Super Bowl, it was a whole week long event, and it required them to be inside the secured perimeter. That's one of the reasons why we don't have to have that extend that secured perimeter as far out where we need to. Now, if something changes, which I don't anticipate it to, we would certainly keep the security procedures first at the top of our minds. But we have absolutely no reason, just like we don't for any other large-scale events, to need the use of the soccer park or the golf course, for example. So if you looked at Super Bowl, they were landing Black Hawk helicopters and things of that nature in preparation for the Super Bowl and things of that nature. We don't feel that that's, as a result of the current status of this event, necessary to engage in the use of those facilities.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
The other reason I ask is just because there are going to be some events covered in Santa Clara and, you know, the convention center. So I would imagine there would be some media wanting to capture some of that, you know, excitement, and so that they can showcase it to when they go to another venue.
And we'll be able to accommodate them accordingly.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
City manager, our executive director. I have a question regarding the assignment agreement, and that just reading what was previously entered into with the former Stadium Authority executive director, it says that there, at that time, there was an estimated financial loss of $5 million. And then reading the operational management that is highlighted on page 12 here, it says that, accepted with clarification, stadium will continue daily operations. The host committee has raised $5 million to fund all expenses associated with hosting this event. The total cost responsibility of the host committee for all obligations in this bid shall be capped at $5 million, host committee expense cap. Is that still an agreement, or is that being reconsidered as a result of the cost? I mean,
that reference was included for purposes of the point in time when the former executive director was advised of the financial condition. My understanding is through subsequent discussions or with amendments to that agreement that the cap was removed. But they're not my agreements. They're the stadium manager's. He has by far more detailed knowledge if you want to add additional comments.
That is correct. And the size and scope of the event from 2015 to now is exponentially grown. Yeah.
Okay, so that will be changed as a result and be brought back to us later on in May to review.
No, the reference is part of what was originally contemplated in 2015 when the executive director was advised. Since then, an amendment to that agreement has already been executed to lift the cap. What you will assign is the CFP game agreement between CFP and MANCO to the Bay Area Host Committee. So the original agreements will be assigned to the nonprofit entity.
Okay, thank you. Then regarding, again, going back to 2015 when this was entered into the bid document, have we seen the bid document that was prepared and what all the you know, ins and outs of the agreements as part of that bid agreement? We've seen it?
We have
We have.
seen the bid agreement and have possession of documents.
Okay. And then going forward, with I appreciate, you know, that hiring, you know, somebody to do an audit of the event once everything is said and done. Will the host committee and Manco be cooperating in the audit once everything is said and done?
I want to express that the language on the PowerPoint was pretty much collaborated between the stadium manager and myself. It is all in the details of how we pencil it out in the agreement in terms of final decision-making. There is an understanding, and I do not want to speak for the stadium manager, that we have a desire to have this fully audited. We have agreement on a third independent party. And beyond that, those are details that we'll need to work out in the language.
Okay, okay, thank you.
I don't know, I don't want to.
No, that's
Okay, good.
Okay, one last thing. Great America, is Great America engaged in this in any way? Are they participating? Will the park be open or any events? I mean, I
Yes.
know you mentioned the pre-game event, but the park itself?
Yeah, so we recently were informed by CFP that there is an interest to have a portion of the park operating for one of those activations. We've reached out to Mr. Renborg, and he is in talks with us. He now is providing us detail. He is part of the May 3rd event as well, so we have reached out with the folks in Great America.
Great, okay, I'm happy to hear that.
Yeah.
And I'm glad to know that we've got 7,500 rooms booked here in Santa Clara. Do we have any idea how many have been booked in San Jose? Are we privy to those?
I don't have that information in front of me, but I'm happy to look at that and try to find out what those numbers look like, for
Great.
sure.
Great, thank you. And I'm just happy to see that, you know, all the transportation entities are involved as well, and hopefully we can use a lot of them to cut down on the traffic impact to the city during the course of the event. So, but thank you very much for both presentations.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Authority Member Mahan, you had additional comments?
Yes, thank you. Following up on those agreements, I want to emphasize or clarify that the Stadium Authority Executive Director reported that any venue agreement will make sure that the city parking fee is charged and paid over to the city. Is that right?
That's one of our terms for the agreement, yes.
And then the other is that the ticket surcharge will also be charged and paid over to the city. Is that right?
Yes, included in the slide in your presentation.
Yeah, so I don't
The
want to overlook the
$4.
fact that these will be positive revenue streams to the city, that we're not losing, you know, they're still going to be in place for this event, and that will still be income to the city. What we're talking about really is if the event, because of the nature of the event that it is, if there's costs that aren't covered by the nonprofit organization, by the host committee, those will totally be absorbed by Manco and no loss to the city. But in addition, we will have these revenue streams directly to the city. And then there's also that penumbra of outside sources coming in from TOT, sales tax, restaurants, all of the rest of it. And you said you didn't have numbers for Atlanta, but we did have, I think we saw somewhere numbers for Phoenix and Dallas, which I believe were $270 million and $300 million respectively. Isn't that right?
That's right. And Dallas, I think, was actually 306. So yeah, there's no question that the impact is sizable.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I want to clarify, so the revenue from parking will go to the Stadium Authority, and as you mentioned, that it will be fully absorbed by Manco. Through the assignment, it will be fully absorbed by Bay Area Host Committee. Separate entity.
Okay, I don't see any other comments, so I'm going to ask my questions now. So the way I understand this event, it won't be an NFL event, it won't be a non-NFL event, it'll be a separate event. Is that correct?
No, it is a non-NFL
It's
event.
a sub event of a non-NFL event, where we're going to look at it separately. It's not going to run through the books of the stadium management.
Well, okay, so under the lease, you have two categories of events, NFL events and non-NFL events. This is a non-NFL event. And so because we did not want the Also under the lease, the revenue and the expenses of non-NFL events go to the stadium authority. Because this is a net negative revenue, we did not want that to impact the lease or the management agreement in a negative way, and that's the reason that we are taking this non-NFL event and assigning it to a nonprofit to absorb the net negative revenue.
So we're using the assignment agreement approach.
For a
non-NFL
as
event.
the city manager put it, isolate the stadium authority financials from the negative impact of this event from a financial standpoint.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. So it is a non-NFL event. It's treated as such, but it's isolated from the others because we can't absorb that loss
Through a separate agreement.
per separate agreement. And so what you're asking for us tonight is to confirm the terms that you've proposed for this assignment agreement that will be brought back sometime in May 18th?
May 29th.
Oh, May 29th. Okay. So understanding that, I'm going to ask Mr. Mercurio, did the previous host committees in these other cities, did they also assume all the financial risks for the event in the cities that they were hosted in?
I believe that's correct. I know that Atlanta was somewhere upwards of 12 or 14 million dollars. A lot of these cities, what they do is they recognize the importance of this event. There was 15 cities that we were up against, and many of the cities actually have an arm for this. We recognize that Santa Clara did not, which is one of the reasons why we came to the city manager when she was recently appointed to talk about that option. Because we recognize Santa Clara is different.
So to ask the question again, did the cities assume the loss, or did the host committees of these events assume the loss, like your like this structure now, where the host committee is going to take on all the costs of the event? Was it the same in the other cities or not?
No, I think it's different. I think other cities have either arms or divisions where they actually invest in a game like this. So there's host committees for certain. There's also city commitments, large commitments from other cities that would absorb, in this particular case, this number of $12 million. That's as an estimate that the cities, in many cases, have put up these funds.
Assume the risk. Okay. So this is a little bit unusual for us, and that's why I think we're asking a lot of questions, since this is the first time we've had the opportunity to look at this information and talk about the college game, and we're very excited to have it in Santa Clara in January of 2019. We're very excited. We don't want her alma mater, because we'll make less money in the city. They'll all drive here, right? But we won't talk about that. But anyways.
I can't control that.
Okay, so since we were a part of the bid for Super Bowl. The Stadium Authority Board was very involved in the public portion of the Super Bowl bid, and we were also heavily involved for many years in the preparation of Super Bowl. In this event here, we've had absolutely no connection to it or information about it. The bid went in without any, you said that there was some discussion with the previous Stadium Authority Director, City Manager, but there was no information. Who actually put the bid in? Who did the bid come from for this event?
So the 49ers Management Company, like we would do as we go out to many large-scale, or all large-scale events that we host, would have that responsibility and did that. And we did that in consultation with the previous city managers. And again, when Ms. Santana came on board, we brought that to her attention as well.
Okay, so I know that I've read about discussions you've had with San Jose and events you've had in San Jose, and I think this is probably similar to what happened with Super Bowl, where Santa Clara had the Super Bowl game here, and most of the events took place in San Francisco, and that was by design at the time. So is it the same here with Santa Clara having the game and most of the events taking place in San Jose?
So I would say in a slightly different way, the crux of the event is the main event. It is at Levi Stadium. The ancillary events, although not all, some of them are in Santa Clara and some of them are in San Jose. And a large part has to do with the infrastructure and the requirements of the CFP. As the city develops, I certainly would love to see more of those ancillary events here in Santa Clara. But again, we know we have some limitations. The size, for example, again, of the convention center, unfortunately, just we lose out on some of that business, right? So, but yeah, there's some events in San Jose, and there's the main event, which everybody's eyes are on, will be in Santa Clara here at Levi Stadium.
Jim, are there any public events besides the game in Santa Clara?
So I would look to, well, other than the championship tailgate is a huge event, but you're talking about free public events, so to speak.
Right.
There may be some other media events inside of Santa Clara, but for the most part, the primary events or the smaller or ancillary events that the CFP requires of us would be in San Jose, based on, again, the infrastructure.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for those answers.
Sure.
So, Executive Director, I see that you have outlined the conditions of the assignment agreement that you'd like to see the Stadium Board support. And I concur with all those conditions, and I'd also like to add an additional one. Based on the fact that we've had so many issues with our Harvey Rose audit in terms of the difficulty of the city staff billing for particular public safety or city staff time and others with our existing structure. And I know we are following the 37 recommendations, and we're changing the way we manage the stadium internally with our city staff and others to add another layer on for, isolating the college football game, I think is going to be problematic and expensive for us. I would like to see, and I think Authority Member Davis hinted at this, is that if we could get some kind of an escrow fund for the 12 million or whatever it takes to pay the expenses of all the city expenses, so we actually build the fund or build the host committee or however the mechanics of it work, so we're not running all of these bills and costs and this burden through the city's general fund. I think it would save us a lot of time, money, and effort to do that. So however your mechanics work, where the money's put in, so then we're not, mistakenly billing a construction fund or a discretionary fund or some of these other, city funds. And so we make sure all the money is captured and the general fund is paid, is made whole, and we don't have to run all these bills through the city. So I'd like to see that structure added, or at least brought back to us in May, so that we can consider that. And other than that, I think that all the recommendations are solid, and I'm in favor of all of them.
I hear the input from the mayor. I think it's important that that you express it either as the board or I'm not certain whether it's an individual board member.
No, that's fine. If there's
there's
motion.
there's logistics that I guess I'd want to accept this as a research opportunity rather than pure directive. There's logistics and financials and things of that sort that we need to go through, but I also want to just remind us of our governance, that we should.
Well, I assume
you should act as a board in this manner.
I totally agree. I assume that is that a recommendation regarding the assignment agreement? Are those items, what is the action this evening? Maybe that's my better question.
This is a study, it's a study session, and often by study sessions, you provide input to staff by consensus. And I am just trying to get clarity around these comments as I've taken notes, that as I take it back, is is this a statement by consensus of the board, or is it by input from one individual board member? And that we will look into this and come back timely to provide a response to the board, how, if this is the desire and pleasure of the board, how we would proceed.
So are you looking for a, what, consensus? Are you looking for a vote? Are you,
That's
what are
generally
you, tell
how.
us what you're looking for
Okay,
this
for
evening.
study sessions,
Okay?
you don't take action.
All
What
right.
you have done in the past as your governance structure to hint to us in providing input as the board or as the council is that you use the term by consensus of the board.
Are you
or by
looking for
consensus of
head
council.
nods? Is that what you're looking for?
I'm looking to understand what you're driving at, because I think my understanding of what the full board would like to do in terms of when we negotiate these terms with the host committee, I think what I'm hearing is you want to have guarantee of payment and complete transparency.
Absolutely, yes.
And if that's the goal, I think we understand that, and that's what we have always intended on doing. The use of the word escrow kind of threw me because I'm not really sure what that does or what that means.
I guess I need to ask, are you talking about pre-funding or reimbursement or?
I'm talking about pre-funding so that the money doesn't have to come out of our general fund. And this is, here, I'm going to give you an example because there was plenty of them during our audit process where we have a public safety officer who's working part-time for the city, part-time for the stadium authority, and then this would add another level, part-time for the college game. And all of this is running through our general fund. Therein lies the problem which was outlined in our audit. And so if this is a separate non-NFL event, I would like to see the monies separate as well and not running through either the stadium authority budget or the general fund of the city.
Understood. I think
that's the intent.
In terms of the public safety folks who are city employees, we have to pay them directly from the city because they are our employees. They have to be on our payroll. If what we're talking about is the other folks that we hire, for example, highway patrol, other things like that, we can explore perhaps another way of not running that money through the general fund.
I don't really want to do this right now.
Okay.
I just want to give you
I'm hearing
direction.
it as a research
Okay.
project.
Transparency, openness, separation.
I'm
Got
hearing
it.
it as
Yes,
research,
got it.
and I'm hearing it as either it's pre-funding is the key term,
Correct.
not reimbursement.
Correct.
I guess I need the board to tell me
All
is
right,
that
so
consensus of the board
okay.
or is-
Because my sense is, I think some of the concern I have is that, as Angie's trying to manage our day-to-day finances, I don't want, have millions of dollars tied up while we're waiting for a reimbursement. So my concern is to limit that as much as possible so that the day-to-day operation, financial operations can go as smoothly as possible and not have to wait for rather large reimbursements.
Okay, we'll hold that. Authority Member Mahan?
Yes, thank you. My understanding, one of the results of the audit was that some public safety costs weren't timely reimbursed, but that was on our side because we didn't have the proper codes in place. The city manager didn't have the proper CMD in place. Those things as a result of the audit have been corrected. I understand what the city attorney is saying. We can't set up a separate funds for paying our city employees, even when they're working for the stadium authority. We now have in place sufficient procedures that when immediately the 49ers are billed, they're going to pay for those costs. I have absolute trust in our city staff. I have absolute trust in our CFO and our finance department that they will adequately track all of the things that we are obligated to pay as a city for our city employees. The 49ers will pay us, or the host committee will pay us back right away. Those will be reimbursed. I don't know that there's any other way to do that. If there are other costs that can be set up in a separate line item account, i.e. a escrow account. I know you're a realtor, you're dealing with real estate transactions, that's how they do it, so maybe you're using that term generically. But if you're just talking about a line item account where it can be separately accounted for, then I'm sure our finance department can do that. And if that's what you're talking about, then yeah, I think I would support that, because we do want to make sure that we don't have any unreimbursed costs, that nothing slips through the cracks. I think that's the bottom line, is we want to make sure that all of these promises are kept, nothing falls through the cracks. And like I say, I have enough trust in our very excellent staff to make sure that that doesn't happen. So if that helps the city manager, or sorry, the Stadium Authority Executive Director, to add my consensus to that extent, then yes, I think you can come back with some options and let us know how that will flow through and what that part of the arrangement will look like.
It's not a matter of trust, it's a matter of floating $12 million through our general fund for expenses. So I think maybe we ought to put this back on the agenda for actual action so that we can take action on moving ahead, because I have different ideas after seeing what our city staff has gone through and trying to allocate costs and that, and to have this tremendous millions of dollars that are going to flow through our general fund is going to be problematic for us. So bring back some options for us. I'd like to see, is there a consensus that we can look at options? Everyone okay with that? Head nods? No head nods?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
Yes.
Did you see at least a majority were head nodding yes? Options. Okay.
My goal is to try to bring this back by either May 8th, at latest May 15th, just given we're still trying to meet the May 29th deadline.
And are we in consensus with the rest of the recommendations on the assignment agreement that were outlined here today?
Yes.
At least 5 head nods here?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
If I can just clarify one thing, the amount of expenses, though arguably 12 million is just an estimate, those aren't your city costs. So the cost that you're referring to would be like public safety costs and things of that nature.
And you estimate to be how much?
Hundreds of thousands of dollars, much less than certainly millions.
Oh, less than $1 million?
Yeah, I can't imagine that those costs are anywhere near. So I just wanted to kind of give you a little bit of
okay,
size
well,
and
thank
scope.
you. That's
Okay, sure.
that's good to know. And
Yeah,
then
yeah, yeah.
one other thing in terms of the overall economic benefit for the area, we did go through Super Bowl, which I would say is the most high-profile event that one can have in their city. And we did an analysis after as to actually what the city generated in terms of transient occupancy tax, sales tax, and other benefits to the city. So, so we know what Super Bowl brought in. So, and I know other cities did as well. So we'll be curious to see what this brings in, which I'm going to call it a little Super Bowl. So anyways, all right, I think we're good at this point. Do I have any members of the public? I don't have any cards here wanting to speak on the issue. If not, it's the end of the study session, and we're going to take a 7-minute break before our council meeting. And I apologize to everyone. This was a really long discussion on this, but we'll be back in 7 minutes. Thank you all for coming.